Hello, in this video I want to explain why communism isn't so hated as Nazism, and I also want to explain what important historical facts PragerU simply fails to mention in their analysis of this interesting question. Okay, let us start.
When people describe particularly evil individuals or regimes, why is it that they use the terms Nazi or fascist, but almost never communist? Given the unparalleled amount of human suffering communists have caused, why is communist so much less a term of revulsion than Nazi? Communists killed 70 million people in China, more than 20 million people in the Soviet Union, not including about 5 million Ukrainians, and almost 1 out of every 3 Cambodians. And communists enslaved entire nations in Russia, Vietnam, China, Eastern Europe, North Korea, Cuba, and much of Central Asia. They ruined the lives of well over 1 billion people.
I just have to make 2 quick observations and then we will continue. It is true that communists enslaved entire nations, but who else had a huge colonial empire at the time? The British had 40% of the surface of the earth under their control, the French had somewhere around 10%, then you had smaller colonial empires like Portugal, Belgium, Spain, so it's not like only one side was quote-unquote enslaving people. And okay, I simply have to mention a very obvious fact, and that is communism was in power for, roughly speaking, 70 years, and Hitler was in power for 13 years, and yet he still managed to cause a war that killed, some would say, even 100 million people, others would say 80 million, some would say 50 million, let's go with 80 million. And he was in charge of a population, if you count the enlarged Germany that he conquered, he was in charge of somewhere around 80 million people, and he managed to kill the same amount of people. And Stalin, by the way, never came close to killing the entire population of his country. Neither did Mao Zedong. I mean, he did cause massive famines that killed 38 million, but that 38 million, if you look at the percentage of the Chinese population, is only 4%, while, for example, the Great Potato Famine that was caused by the British in Ireland killed 20% of the Irish. So we have to bear in mind simply the size of the population that Mao Zedong and Stalin had. That was much larger than what Hitler had. Okay, but let us continue.
So why doesn't communism have the same terrible reputation as Nazism? Reason number 1, there is, simply put, widespread ignorance of the communist record. Whereas both right and left loathe Nazism and teach its evil history, the left, and I'm talking about the left, not traditional liberals, like Harry Truman or John F. Kennedy, has never loathed communism. And since the left dominates academia, almost no one teaches communism's evil history. Reason number 2, the Nazi...
Okay, just a quick intervention. I don't think that there is this leftist conspiracy in schools that refuses to teach you about the horrors of communism. Well, first of all, the communists won the war together with liberals, and as the ancient Roman saying says, victors write history. So yeah, that is partially why the crimes of communism are maybe not that well known. Although I would argue that at this point they are pretty much well known, well discussed about, whether we are talking about Holodomor or just generally Soviet atrocities. Okay, maybe I'm being biased because I'm coming from the Balkans, from Eastern Europe. So in my country, communist crimes are very much discussed. But yeah, what I wanted to say, there is even an ultra-nationalist American argument for why the crimes of Nazism should be more discussed, or at least for why they are more discussed. Hitler declared war on the United States. Stalin never did such a thing. That's the difference. So if a country directly attacks you, it in most cases results in you hating that country more than other countries. That is at the root of this problem. Why is it that more people are informed about Nazi crimes, at least in the Western world, than about communist crimes? Okay, let us continue.
Nazis carried out the Holocaust. Nothing matches the Holocaust for pure evil. The rounding up of virtually every Jewish man, woman, child, and baby on the European continent and sending them to die is unprecedented and unparalleled. The communists killed far more people than the Nazis, but never matched the Holocaust in the systemization of genocide. The uniqueness of the Holocaust and the enormous attention rightly paid to it have helped ensure that Nazism has a worse name than communism. Reason number 3. Communism is based on nice-sounding.
Okay, let me just say something about the Holocaust. The Holocaust is often in literature compared with, for example, what Stalin did to the kulaks, to the rich peasants. Now, an obvious difference is that Stalin never planned on killing every single rich peasant in his giant country. Those proclaimed kulaks were, roughly speaking, 10 million peasants, and 30% of the 10 million ended up dying. But atrocities in the Soviet Union are often processes that actually lost control. So the local authorities actually proclaimed people kulaks in a very arbitrary way. They were doing it either out of fear that they themselves will be seen as traitors if they do not proclaim enough people as kulaks. They did it in order to just steal money, and for their own personal gain they would proclaim people to be kulaks in order to just steal their land, cattle, possibly women out of their own personal disputes, and just generally out of paranoia. So, well, for the Holocaust, you cannot say that the Nazi state lost control of the process and ended up killing more people than Hitler desired, because Hitler quite explicitly, as PragerU acknowledges, used to say that he takes pride in killing every single Jew under the Nazi occupation. Okay, let us continue.
Theories. Nazism isn't. It's based on heinous-sounding theories. Intellectuals in general, including, of course, the intellectuals who write history, are seduced by words, so much so that they deem actions as less significant than words. For that reason, they haven't focused nearly as much attention on the horrific actions of communists as they have on the horrific actions of the Nazis. They dismiss the evils of communists as perversions of true communism, but they regard Nazi atrocities, correctly, as the logical and inevitable results of Nazism.
Well, to me it seems that even PragerU actually does acknowledge that as an ideology, communism is less bad than Nazism, or most forms of fascism. Now, what I also just want to emphasize is that there were some people, communist dissidents, that claimed that's not true communism, while it was a dangerous thing to say. They ended up in jail or killed, and I do think that when right-wingers imagine people saying that's not true communism, they imagine people today saying it in a very privileged position and kind of just being spoiled and saying that's not true communism while living in a capitalist society and going to college and actually being very rich. But let's take an example of a guy like Gilas, a Yugoslav dissident that wrote the book The New Class, in which he criticized all communist societies for creating this new bureaucratic class that, in his opinion, was too similar to the capitalists of the previous regime, and he ended up in jail for writing that book. In the end, Tito let him escape to the United States. But yeah, I mean, you could argue that Gilas in his critique was perhaps a bit naive, that he I mean, the obvious question is then, how would you solve that problem? Would you just abolish the state immediately? What would you do? But that's a topic for another video. But yes, so people saying that's not true communism often ended up in jail, and actually that was quite a brave thing to say back in the day. while there are simply no people saying that's not true. Nazism, because Nazism is all about harming certain groups of people. Okay, let us continue.
Reason number 4. Germans have thoroughly exposed the evils of Nazism, have taken responsibility for them, and have attempted to atone for them. Russians have not done anything similar regarding Lenin's or Stalin's horrors. To the contrary, Lenin, the father of Soviet communism, is still widely venerated in Russia. And as regards Stalin, as University of London Russian historian Donald Rayfield puts it, quote, people still deny, by assertion or implication, Stalin's Holocaust, unquote. Even less so as China exposed the greatest mass murderer and enslaver of them all, Mao Zedong. Mao remains revered in China. Every Chinese currency note has his picture on it. Until Russia and China and Vietnam and Cuba and North Korea acknowledge the evils their countries committed under communism, communism's evils will remain less known than the evils of the German state under Hitler.
And let me just say one important thing. Well, both Stalin and Mao came to power in some of the most backwards countries on earth. The Russian Empire was the most authoritarian, the most backwards country in Europe, and China was just a collection of warlords, essentially fighting each other. And okay, territories under Chiang Kai-shek that were extremely corrupt and inefficient. So, for Mao and Stalin, if you compare them with what pre-existed them, I would argue they were both better than what pre-existed them, simply because what pre-existed them was so horrible, while Hitler came to power in one of the most progressive countries in Europe. That's an important difference between Hitler and Mao and Stalin.
Reason number 5. Communists murdered mostly their own people. The Nazis, on the other hand, killed very few fellow Germans. World opinion, that largely meaningless and amoral term, deems the murder of members of one's own group far less noteworthy than the murder of outsiders. That's why, for example, blacks killing millions of fellow blacks in Africa elicits almost no attention from world opinion. And reason number 6. In the view of the left, the last good war was World War II, the war against German Nazism and Japanese fascism. The left does not regard wars against communist regimes as good wars. For example, the American war against Vietnamese communism is regarded as immoral, and the war against Korean communism and its Chinese communist backers is simply ignored. Until the left and all the institutions influenced by the left acknowledge how evil communism has been, we will continue to live in a morally confused world. In the meantime, all good people owe it to the victims of communism to learn what happened to them. Even worse than being murdered or enslaved is a world that doesn't even know that you were.
Okay, yeah, I agree. We should learn about the evils of communism, and I do think that what's to me fascinating about the evils of communism is actually studying how did we get there and what was the ideology behind it, because the evils of fascism are much more straightforward. Like there is nothing that's surprising and tragic about. I mean, okay, it is tragic in a different way, but there is nothing really surprising about Hitler coming to power and then killing a bunch of people. While what's fascinating about communism is, I mean, trying to point actually where and when did things go so wrong, and why did they go so wrong. And I don't think that there is a clear answer for that. But I do think that one of the reasons for why things went downhill, let's say, in the Soviet Union, is because you can't simply create a liberal, prosperous society out of the ruins or out of the ashes of one of the most backward empire in Europe, which was the Russian Empire. You simply can't do it. It was never done in history, which is why I think that comparing the Soviet Union and the amount of liberties and individual rights in the Soviet Union with, for example, the United States, or I should be more precise, like white people in the United States at the time, is kind of a flawed way of comparing things. Like, of course, that in Siberia, an average guy did not even realize that individual rights should exist, nor did he actually realize that freedom of speech should exist. We know that by actually some Soviet immigrants that escaped to the United States were asked, did you maybe escape because you wanted the freedom of speech? And the Siberian peasants were kind of confused, and they asked, what is the freedom of speech? They escaped because, for example, they were afraid that they might end up in a gulag, or they just heard that people are richer in the United States. But okay, that's all for this video, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe if you liked this video.